The coffee was already made before any of them woke up. 3 mugs. Exactly 3. Set at the edge of the kitchen counter where hands could find them without looking. The smell was strong, dark roast, no sugar, the way they liked it. And the one who made it, he was already back in his room before the first set of footsteps hit the hallway floor. Nobody noticed.
That's the part that matters. Not the coffee. Not even the silence. What matters is that nobody noticed and nobody was supposed to. This is a story about power. And the one thing power forgets to measure. The Nocthra Syndicate ran 6 city blocks of underground operations across the east side of the city. Not the kind of thing that shows up in a news report. Not the kind of thing anybody confirms over the phone. It was the kind of power you felt before you saw it. In a way, traffic moved differently near their building. In a way, certain businesses never got robbed. In a way, certain people disappeared quietly and nobody filed paperwork. 3 men ran it. Brothers. Triplets. Cade, Varric, and Soren Ashford. And if you knew those names, you already knew enough to stay out of their way.
Hi viewers. Real quick, before we go any further, have you ever worked so hard to not be a burden to someone that you ended up hurting yourself in the process? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. Cade was the one who planned everything. Every move, every contract, every exit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When Cade spoke, the room adjusted. His decisions came out flat and final, the way a judge drops a gavel. No appeal, no negotiation, just the sound of a conclusion. He was 31 years old, and he had the eyes of a man who had already calculated every outcome of every room he had ever walked into. Varric was built different. Physically, emotionally, every way possible. He was the one you sent when a conversation needed to stop being a conversation. Broad across the shoulders, quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He had never once failed a job. Not once. Soren ran operations. Logistics, schedules, personnel, routes. If Cade was the brain and Varric was the force, Soren was the machine that kept both of them functioning at full speed. He was the one on 4 phones at once. The one who could tell you, without looking at a calendar, exactly where each of their people were supposed to be at any given hour. Together, they had built something almost untouchable. Their apartment was not an apartment in any real sense. It was a command center with furniture. The living room had a couch, yes, but it also had 3 monitors, 2 encrypted phones charging at all times, a whiteboard covered in names and arrows, and a kitchen table that served more as a document surface than a place to eat. There was warmth in the building's bones, in the original architecture. High ceilings, wide windows, a view of the city that should have felt like something. But that warmth had been covered, replaced. The Ashford brothers didn't do warmth. They did results. And results had a particular look. It looked like paperwork and whiteboards and the low hum of machines that never fully powered down. Ezra, one of their mid-level lieutenants, once described working under them as being inside a clock. Every gear knew its purpose. Every second was accounted for. Nothing wasted. Nothing overlooked. Except one thing. His name was Elio Damien Osei. He came to them 3 months ago. Not by choice, not by contract, but by circumstance. Pulled from a trafficking ring the syndicate dismantled during a rival territory conflict. He was 19, blind since 14, and the reason they kept him instead of sending him to a shelter was purely operational. He had overheard names, routes, internal codes. Until the situation was fully contained, he stayed under their roof. That was the word Soren used when he filed the internal report. Contained. Not protected. Not housed. Contained. Like a variable that hadn't been resolved yet. Like a number you write at the edge of a page and mean to come back to. Elio Damien Osei was, by every official record in the Nocthra Syndicate, temporary. He memorized the apartment in 4 days. Not because anyone showed him around, because no one did. He figured it out by walking slowly, touching walls, counting steps, listening to where sound bounced differently. 14 steps from his bedroom door to the kitchen. 3 steps left from the refrigerator to the stove. The kettle lived on the back left burner. The mugs were on the second shelf. He had to reach slightly, up on his toes. He learned the sound the refrigerator made before the ice dispenser cycled. He learned which window had a loose latch by the low whistle it made on windy mornings. He learned all of it alone, in the dark, while 3 of the most powerful men in the city sat 20 feet away and discussed logistics. He made their coffee every morning because it gave him something to do, not because they asked, not because he expected a thank you, because silence, he had learned a long time ago, was easier to survive when your hands were busy. Idle hands meant idle thoughts, and idle thoughts, for someone in his position, had a way of going to dark places very fast. Nobody expected Elio Osei to matter to anyone in that apartment. Nobody expected that 3 months later, one of those 3 men would be standing in a hospital hallway, unable to breathe. Power systems don't fail because of enemies. They fail because no one thinks to ask who gets overlooked inside them. 4:57 in the morning. Elio was already awake. He didn't need an alarm. His body had adjusted weeks ago, tuned itself to the rhythm of the apartment the way a musician tunes to a room. He knew when the heating system clicked on, that low mechanical shudder that traveled through the vents at exactly 4:42. He knew which floorboard near Varric's door gave a low creak when weight shifted on it. He knew the exact number of seconds between Cade's light turning on and the sound of his shower starting. 43 seconds. Cade never varied it.
He knew all of it, and none of them knew a single thing about him. He moved through the kitchen with the kind of quiet that comes from practice, not caution, practice. His fingers found the kettle without searching. The coffee grounds were in the same position he had left them, second cabinet, right side, lid slightly loose so he could feel the difference from the other containers. He measured by feel. He had gotten it right every time. He also knew, because he paid attention to everything, that Cade preferred his coffee slightly stronger than the other 2. He had started adjusting the ratio by feel 3 weeks in. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody would. But Cade always finished his mug first. That mattered to Elio in a way he couldn't fully explain. 3 mugs on the counter. He stepped back. This was his morning. This was it. The whole thing. He would make the coffee, retreat to his room, and wait out the hours until the apartment either emptied for the day or the noise of their work pulled his attention toward the kitchen again, where he would quietly refill whatever needed refilling and disappear again before anyone had a reason to speak to him. He ate alone. Always. Not because they told him to, because the alternative. Sitting at that table, while Cade reviewed contracts and Soren cross-referenced schedules, and Varric cleaned a weapon in total silence, was somehow worse than eating standing up in a quiet kitchen with only the sound of the refrigerator humming for company. It wasn't that the table made him uncomfortable. It was that the table made him visible. And visibility in that apartment felt like a liability.
He had learned that early. There was a Tuesday 3 weeks after he arrived. Soren had left a folder on the counter. Important papers. Elio could tell by the way Soren had set them down, that particular flat palm press that meant he was stressed. Soren's hands had a language that nobody else in the apartment read. Elio read all of it. A phone rang in the other room. Soren left to answer it. 2 other men from the syndicate. He had heard them called Reese and Tolliver by voice. Were sitting at the table running numbers out loud. Elio heard them make an error. A simple one. Subtraction. They were off by $2,000 on a projected loss figure, and they were about to build a whole recommendation on top of it. The kind of mistake that compounds. The kind that costs more the longer it goes uncorrected. He said it once. Quietly. Clearly. The number is wrong. You're reading the column from last quarter. Silence. Not the kind of silence that means someone is thinking. The kind that means nobody heard you or nobody wanted to. There is a difference, and Elio had learned to tell them apart. One of the men kept talking. The other flipped a page. That was it. That was the whole thing. Elio stood there for another 3 seconds. 3 full seconds. He counted them. Then he turned and walked back to his room and closed the door without a sound. He sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms flat against his thighs and stared at nothing the way people who cannot see still stare at nothing when something has just confirmed what they were already afraid to believe. He didn't try again after that. What's strange, what most people wouldn't understand, is that it wasn't the being ignored that broke something in him. He had been ignored his whole life in small ways. Passed over. spoken around. Addressed as if his blindness was the whole of him and the rest could be summarized quickly. What broke something was the realization that came after. That if he had simply not spoken, if he had stayed in his room, if he had never existed in that kitchen at that moment, the outcome of the entire interaction would have been exactly the same. His presence made no difference. His absence wouldn't either. That understanding settled into him like cold water. Slow. Complete. The kind of cold that doesn't shock you, it just takes over degree by degree until you stop feeling the temperature at all. He stopped speaking in common spaces entirely. Nobody noticed that either. November came in hard that year. Early frost, gray skies, the kind of cold that pushes into buildings through window seams and old pipes. Elio felt the season shift before the temperature outside confirmed it. He felt it in the quality of the air inside the apartment. Drier. Sharper. The kind of air that sits in your throat differently. He pulled his sleeves down further. He slept with an extra layer. Small adjustments. Private ones. And then one afternoon, while standing alone in the kitchen waiting for the kettle, he coughed. Once. He pressed his fist to his mouth and stood very still, as if stillness could reverse what had just happened. As if the sound could be recalled before anyone heard it. There was no one in the kitchen. That part was fine. But the cough itself, the feeling of it, that rough catch deep in his chest, that was the part that stayed with him. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that with complete confidence. The kettle finished. He poured. He left. But winter had just arrived. And that cough? It did not go away. The name came in at 11:43 on a Wednesday night. DeMarco Bricks. Mid-level operator running product through the South Corridor. A route the Nocthra Syndicate had controlled for 4 years without interruption. He had flipped. Gone to a rival crew called the Voss Network, taken 3 distribution contacts with him, and in one move had cost the Syndicate access to a stretch of territory worth more per month than most people made in a year. This wasn't just a defection. It was a statement. It was someone deciding that the Ashford brothers' reach had a limit, and deciding to find out where that limit was. Cade stood at the whiteboard for 40 minutes without speaking. Nobody else spoke either. Nobody moved. There were 4 other people in that room, and every one of them found something on the floor to look at while Cade's mind worked. That was the thing about Cade. His silence wasn't empty. You could feel it working, like standing next to a machine with the casing removed. When he finally turned around, his eyes were the kind of flat that made people in the room look at the floor all over again. Nobody sleeps until this is resolved, he said. And nobody did. The apartment shifted overnight. It stopped being a space where 3 men happened to work and started being something else entirely. Something with edges. The couch disappeared under printed maps and call logs. The kitchen table was taken over by Soren's laptops. Both of them running at once, screens bright in the dark at 3 and 4 in the morning. Varric was gone by 1 a.m. and didn't return until the following evening. And when he did, he showered without speaking and went straight to the whiteboard and stood there for 10 minutes with his arms crossed before Cade joined him, and they spoke in low voices about things that were not written on paper. 18-hour days. Then 20. Then the kind of grind that doesn't have a number anymore. It just has a start time and no confirmed end. Elio was non-essential. He understood that without being told. He felt the shift in the apartment's energy the same way he felt weather, through texture, through temperature, through the quality of sound and silence in a space. This was not the regular silence. This silence had weight to it. Edges. He pulled back further than usual. Stayed in his room longer. Moved through the kitchen only in the early morning hours when no one was yet awake. Made the coffee. Set the 3 mugs. Left. He did not exist during this period. Not officially. Not in any way that anyone tracked. But here is what nobody in that apartment knew. Elio's chest had not gotten better. Not since that first cough in November. In fact, since the cold settled in fully and the apartment's heating ran on a different schedule because nobody had adjusted the thermostat in weeks, the tightness had become something else. Something with weight to it. He woke up some mornings with a low heat behind his eyes that he recognized. Not from memory but from the particular way it changed his perception of everything. Sounds seemed slightly farther away. His sense of direction inside the apartment, usually precise, had a lag to it now. A half-second hesitation where there used to be certainty. The fever wasn't high. He knew what high felt like. He had run fevers before. This was not that. This was the low kind. The persistent kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but instead just sits on top of everything else and makes every task cost a little more energy than it should. He told himself, "It's manageable." He told himself, saying something would only create a problem. He told himself, "They have enough going on." All three of those things were true, and all three of them were the reason he stayed quiet, the reason he kept moving, the reason he set the 3 mugs every morning and retreated and waited. On a Thursday morning, day 9 of the crisis, he carried the kettle from the stove to the counter. His hand trembled once. The kettle knocked against the edge of a mug. A hollow clang. Not loud. Not dramatic. But in an apartment where everyone had tuned their senses to catch problems before they escalated. Cade looked up from the table. 1 second. Maybe 2. Looked back down. Varric didn't look up at all. He was on a call. Hand pressed against his ear. Voice low and controlled. Soren was in the hallway. Phone pressed between his shoulder and cheek. Writing something on the doorframe with a pen he would forget was there. 3 seconds, and Elio was already forgotten. He set the kettle down carefully. Waited. The trembling passed. He filled the mugs with a steadiness that cost him more effort than anyone watching would have guessed. Then he walked back to his room. That evening, for the first time since he had arrived in the Ashford apartment, Elio Osei did not eat dinner. He sat on the edge of his bed and thought about getting up and decided against it and lay back down instead. He told himself he wasn't hungry. But his body was running a fever that had been quietly climbing for longer than a week. And somewhere inside that silence, something had already begun to tip past the point where rest alone could fix it. He woke up on the floor. Not dramatically. Not with a crash or a cry. He simply came back to himself. That slow, confusing return that follows unconsciousness. And realized he was lying on the cold hardwood floor of his bedroom, and the last clear thing he remembered was sitting on the edge of his bed, trying to decide if he had the energy to take his shoes off. He lay there for a moment, took stock. His cheek was against the floor. He could feel the cold of it on his skin, and the cold felt better than it should have, which told him something right away. He pushed himself upright. His arms shook on the way up. Not a little. Genuinely shook, the kind of instability that comes from muscle weakness, not nerves. He made it to the bed and sat with his hands flat on his knees and did the thing he had learned to do alone, the methodical private inventory. Start at the top. Work down. No panic. Just information. His head. Hot. Not warmly hot. Deeply hot. The kind that sat behind his eyes and made the pressure in his skull feel elevated. His ears had a dullness to them that wasn't normal, like someone had pressed cotton against the outsides and left it there. His chest. This was the part that required the most attention. There was a weight in it now that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago. Not pain exactly. More like pressure. Like something solid had settled behind his sternum and was making its presence known every time he inhaled past a shallow point. He tried once, a full breath all the way down. The breath caught somewhere in the middle. Resisted. He finished it carefully and did not try again immediately. His legs. Functional. But the floor incident made the word functional feel very generous. This was not manageable. He sat with that truth for a long time. Let it settle. Did not argue with it. Then he thought about what saying something would actually look like in practice. Not in theory, in practice. He would have to get off this bed. Cross the room. Open the door without stumbling. Find one of them, and they were always somewhere in the apartment now. The crisis had made the place feel like it breathed people constantly, and say what exactly? I feel sick. I have a fever. I need something. He turned those sentences over in his mind and tried to find a version of any of them that didn't feel like an interruption. Like a liability. Like a problem added to a pile that was already too high. He couldn't find one. He thought about Cade specifically. Cade would handle it. That was certain. He would not be cruel about it. He would simply make one call and have someone dispatched, A doctor on retainer, probably the kind of arrangement men like the Ashfords kept for exactly these situations. It would be handled efficiently. Elio would become a task, a checkbox, and then Cade would go back to the whiteboard and the checkbox would sit there, completed, meaning nothing more than it had before. Varric would do nothing because Varric operated on commands, not on perception. You had to name the problem directly or Varric would not register it as his to solve. Soren. Soren was the closest thing to human in that apartment most days. He was the one who occasionally acknowledged Elio's presence in passing. A brief nod when they occupied the same space. A slight pause in movement that suggested he was aware another person was in the room. It was small, but it was more than the other two offered. Still, Soren was running the Syndicate's nervous system right now with no rest and no margin. And the thought of adding himself to that man's already critical load made Elio feel something that wasn't quite guilt but was very close to it. He decided, not yet. One more day. It did not improve. By the second morning that he did not leave his room, the fever had climbed past the territory where he could classify it as low. He felt it in different places now, his jaw, the joints of his fingers, the backs of his knees. Walking to the bathroom required both hands on the wall and one careful step at a time. He breathed through each of these trips in the way a person breathes through pain. Controlled, deliberate, not letting any of it show on his face even though there was nobody there to see his face. The apartment outside his door was always occupied. Never quiet. Voices on calls. The low sound of Cade's footsteps, that particular pattern, 3 steps, stop, turn, 3 steps, that meant he was working through a problem in his head. Soren's typing, fast and then suddenly stopped, fast and stopped again. The distant bass of Varric's voice on a phone he took into the hallway. None of it ever paused. Not once. Not even for a second, in the direction of Elio's door. This is what neglect looks like from the inside of it. Not cruelty. Not intention. Just the complete and total absence of a system that should have existed. Nobody had assigned someone to check on Elio. Nobody had set a reminder. Nobody had built a structure that accounted for the fact that a person was living in this apartment who had no one designated to notice if he was struggling. He had no one designated to notice anything. He existed outside every system they had built. He thought about knocking on Cade's door one more time that night. He even made it off the bed. Feet on the floor, weight shifted forward, hands braced on the mattress edge. He stayed like that for almost a minute, standing, deciding. Then he thought about the Tuesday in the kitchen. The wrong number, the complete and total absence of response. The 3 seconds of standing there and the confirmation that nothing about his presence in that room had changed anything. He sat back down, not with anger, not with resentment, with something quieter and more final than either of those. Just resignation. That night, somewhere around 2 in the morning, he was standing at the side of his bed reaching for the extra blanket on the shelf above his headboard when his legs gave out from under him. No warning, no gradual failing, just gone. And he went down sideways against the bed frame and ended up on the floor with his shoulder pressed into the wood and his breath knocked partially out of him. He lay still, waited, listened. The apartment continued its noise 20 feet away. A phone. Cade's voice, briefly. Soren's keyboard. The refrigerator cycling. The building settling in the cold. Nobody came. After a long while he pulled himself back up using the bed frame and sat on the edge of the mattress with his hands on his knees and his breathing shallow and deliberate. He told himself, tomorrow I will say something. But he had said that exact sentence yesterday. And the day before that. And somewhere between his intention and the reality of that Tuesday kitchen and the reality of contained in a report file and the reality of temporary. Somewhere in all of that, tomorrow had started to feel exactly like never. It was over. DeMarco bricks had been handled. The South Corridor contacts were back in alignment. The Voss network had pulled their people out of the disputed territory by Thursday morning. Quietly and completely, the way organizations retreat when they finally calculate that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of backing down. For weeks of 18-hour days, cold food, no sleep, no margin, no rest, and the Nocthra Syndicate had held every inch of what they built. They had won. Cade stood at the whiteboard and erased the last name. One pass of the eraser, slow and deliberate, and the board was clean. It was a small gesture, almost nothing. But Soren, standing at the kitchen table with his third coffee of the morning, watched it happen and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't even realized was locked. Like a door that had been bolted from the inside finally letting go. Varric sat down on the couch. Actually sat. Not the perched on the edge position he used during operations. The way he held himself like a spring that could uncoil in any direction at any second. He sat back, put his feet on the table, looked at the ceiling. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. They were going to celebrate. Low-key, that was the only way any of them knew how. A few senior lieutenants, a couple of bottles they'd been saving, the heavy crystal glasses that lived in the back of the cabinet and came out maybe twice a year. Soren made the calls. Cade put on a different shirt for the first time in what he later realized was 4 days. Varric cleaned up without being asked, which, if you knew Varric, was its own kind of occasion. The apartment shifted again. But this time it shifted toward something that almost resembled ease. The monitors were still on, they were always on, but the urgency beneath them had drained away. Voices in the living room had a different register now. Looser. There was actual laughter at one point. Low and brief, but it was there, and it was real, and it made the apartment feel like it had walls instead of just surfaces. Nobody checked on Elio. He was awake. Had been awake for most of the night. Not by choice. His body had stopped allowing more than short stretches of sleep days ago. 20 minutes, maybe 30, and then something would drag him back up out of it. The tightness in his chest. The difficulty pulling a full breath. The fever, which had stopped fluctuating and had simply settled at a level that his body was now running on the way an engine runs hot, just below the point of failure, radiating everything it had left. He heard the shift in the apartment. Voices changing register. The particular quality of relief in the way people moved. Faster footsteps, not urgent footsteps, but energized ones. The sound of the good glasses coming out of the back cabinet. He knew which cabinet by the sound of the latch. He had memorized that too. He lay very still for a long time, just listening, and something in what he heard. The laughter, the ease, the sound of 3 men breathing differently for the first time in a month, made something close to grief move through him. Not for himself exactly, just the particular ache of being adjacent to relief you are not part of. Then he got up. He did not get up because he wanted to. He got up because guests were coming. He could already hear Soren on the phone running through arrival times and numbers. And guests meant the kitchen needed to be ready, and over 3 months the kitchen being ready had become the closest thing he had to a role. Not because anyone said so, because he had quietly, carefully built himself into the function of the space, the way water fills whatever shape it's given. He had made himself useful because useful was the one thing he could be that didn't require anyone to look at him and decide he mattered. Usefulness required no decision. It just required presence. He made it to the wall on the first attempt and let himself feel good about that for exactly 2 seconds. Then he moved along it, fingers reading the surface, until he reached the counter. He stopped there and waited for the swim in his head to settle. It always swam now when he stood too quickly. He had learned to factor in the waiting. 5 seconds, sometimes 8, before the room, his version of the room, built entirely from sound and feeling, came back into reliable focus. Then he reached for the tray. He assembled the glasses by touch, found the bottles by their weight and position on the shelf, poured slowly, carefully, listening to the sound of liquid against glass because his hands were not steady enough to go by feel alone anymore. He kept his left hand anchored on the counter the whole time. That hand was his reference point, his ground. As long as that hand knew where it was, the rest of him could function. He needed to say that out loud somewhere because it matters. A 19-year-old. Fever climbing for 2 weeks. Lungs that had already moved past the point where rest and water could turn this around. Legs that had given out twice. Breathing in a careful, measured, deliberately shallow way because full breaths hurt in a place that didn't have a name yet. And he was pouring drinks for a celebration that had no idea he was about to walk through the door. Not because anyone asked. Not because he expected anything in return. Because the only identity left available to him in that apartment was the one he built with his hands. And he was not going to give it up. Not today. Not while his hands still worked. He lifted the tray. The weight shifted wrong. Not because it was heavy, but because his arms had lost the baseline stability they operated on. The tray dipped left and he corrected, and the correction sent a wave of dizziness through him so fast and so complete that he stopped walking entirely and stood in the middle of the hallway with his jaw clenched and his eyes pressed shut and waited for it to pass. His body said, "Put the tray down." He kept holding it. The wave passed. He started walking. 8 steps to the door. He counted carefully. 6, 5. He could hear them on the other side. Voices, the clink of glass, someone making a point and someone else responding, the first sounds of an evening that was actually going to be an evening instead of a crisis. For steps. 3. His right knee gave. He caught himself. Shifted the tray. The correction worked. The glasses didn't fall. But the cost of that correction was everything he had left in his balance. His whole body went to recalibrate and had nothing to recalibrate with. 2 steps from the door. That's how close he was. 2 steps. Elio Osei went down. The tray hit the floor and the sound was enormous in that hallway. Glass and metal and liquid and the hard ring of the tray spinning on its edge before it stopped. The sound cut through every conversation in the apartment like it was designed to. Like it had been waiting. Then silence. Then the door opened. Cade Ashford stepped into the hallway and stopped. And the first thing he saw was not the tray. Not the glass. Not the liquid spreading across the floor. It was Elio, flat on his back. Motionless. Eyes closed. His face flushed in a way that was visible even in the low light of the hallway. His chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven increments. Cade dropped to his knees without a word. He pressed the back of his hand to Elio's forehead and pulled it back immediately. The heat was not what he expected. It wasn't the warmth of a mild fever or the flush of effort or stress. It was the kind of heat that registers as wrong before your brain finishes processing it. The kind that makes experienced people move fast. Soren. His voice came out flat and controlled and carrying something underneath the control that was not calm at all. Call 911. Right now. Varric appeared in the hallway without being summoned. He was already on the phone before Cade finished the sentence. His voice low and direct, already giving the address. And around Elio's body. Around this boy who had made their coffee every morning for 3 months, who had memorized their schedules, who had corrected a math error that nobody heard, who had decided again and again and again not to ask for help because he genuinely did not believe that help was available to him. The apartment reorganized itself with a speed and a focus it had never once directed at his existence before this moment. Elio Osei did not wake up. He was breathing. Barely. But the damage. The 2 weeks of building infection, the fever that had climbed unchecked in a room 20 feet from 3 men who ran an empire, the damage had already moved past the place where hoping was enough. And nobody, not one person, in that entire apartment, in 30 days, had knocked on his door. If you made it this far, you already feel it. You know something is wrong with a system that only notices a person when they fall. Drop a comment right now. Did you think Elio was ever going to say something? Or did you know from the very beginning that he never would? Because the answer to that question says something real about you. Chapter 6 is where everything changes. And it is not going to be easy to watch. The tray was still spinning when Cade reached him. That detail stayed with him later. The way the metal edge of the tray kept making that low, hollow ring against the hardwood, over and over, getting quieter each rotation but not stopping. Like something winding down. Like the sound of a clock that nobody remembered to wind. He dropped to his knees on the floor and the glass crunched under him and he didn't feel it. Elio was on his back. Not curled. Not braced. The way a person lands when their body gives out completely, without preparation, without defense. His arms were at his sides. His head was turned slightly to the right. His chest moved. That was the first thing Cade checked and the only thing that mattered in that first second. His chest moved. But the way it moved was wrong. Short. Too short. And uneven. Like each breath was a negotiation that wasn't going well. Cade pressed the back of his hand to Elio's forehead and understood immediately that this was not a situation that waited. The heat coming off him was not a fever in the way most people used that word. It was the kind of heat that registers as a system in crisis. The kind that means something inside has been burning for a long time. Soren. Flat. Controlled. But underneath the control, something else entirely. Call 911. Right now. Varric was already there. He hadn't been summoned. He had simply appeared, the way Varric always appeared when something in the environment shifted past a certain threshold. Instantly and without sound. He was on the phone before Cade finished speaking, giving the building address in the same tone he used for everything, which was no tone at all. Just facts delivered at speed. Soren came out of the side room. He saw Cade on the floor. He saw Elio. He stopped in the doorway for exactly 1 second. The specific pause of a man whose processing has briefly outrun his ability to act. And then he was moving, crossing the hallway, coming down to one knee. How long has he been like this? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. That was the part that sat in the hallway air like something physical. Nobody knew. The guests were still in the other room. Soren stood up and went to the door and said, quietly and without explanation, that the evening was over. He didn't wait for questions. He closed the door and came back. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Elio did not regain consciousness during those 11 minutes. He stayed where he was, breathing barely, chest working in that shallow, unsteady rhythm that Cade could not stop watching. Cade stayed on the floor beside him the entire time. He didn't touch him again after the initial contact. He wasn't sure why. He just stayed close. One hand flat on the floor near Elio's shoulder. Not touching. Just there. Varric stood at the end of the hallway with his arms crossed. His face gave nothing away. But he hadn't moved either. Soren was on the phone with building security, getting the elevator held open. When the paramedics came in and one of them asked how long the patient had been symptomatic, all three brothers looked at each other across the hallway. None of them had an answer. The paramedic, a woman in her 40s with short gray locks and the kind of efficient calm that comes from seeing too many things, looked at each of them once and then stopped asking and went to work. She called out numbers to her partner. Temperature, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate. Each number landed in the hallway like something dropped from a height. The oxygen number was the one that made Soren go still. They loaded Elio onto a stretcher, put an oxygen mask over his face. The mask was too big for him. Elio was lean, always had been, and under the harsh lights of the emergency kit he looked smaller than he did in the apartment. Younger. Cade stood back to give them room and found that he did not know where to put his hands. That was new. Cade Ashford always knew exactly what to do with his hands. The hospital was 8 minutes away. Varric drove because Varric drove the way he did everything, without hesitation and without error. Cade sat in the back with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor of the car. Soren sat next to him and didn't say anything, which was the right call. The ER team was waiting. Someone had called ahead. They moved fast. The three brothers were directed to a waiting area that was painted a color that had probably once been meant to be calming and had long since stopped being anything at all. They sat. They did not speak. There was a television mounted in the corner running news on mute. Varric looked at it without seeing it. Soren had his phone out but wasn't using it. Cade sat with his hands clasped between his knees and stared at the floor. The doctor came out 47 minutes later. He was tall, young. He had the particular expression of someone who was about to deliver information that was going to require the people receiving it to do some work. "He's stable," he said first. He always said that first. "But I need to be clear with you about what we're looking at. Severe pneumonia, both lungs involved. The infection had progressed far past the early stage, past the middle stage. It had been running unchecked long enough that his body had begun producing a response that was starting to affect other systems. Not quite sepsis. Close enough that the word was in the next sentence. This didn't happen overnight," the doctor said. He looked at all three of them and held the look for a moment. Not accusatory, just factual. The progression we're seeing here is consistent with 2 to 3 weeks of untreated illness. He would have been symptomatic for most of that time. Significant fever, breathing difficulty, fatigue. Cade said nothing. Varric said nothing. Soren said, "We didn't know." The doctor nodded once. He had heard that before. He would hear it again. "He's on 4 antibiotics and supplemental oxygen. We're going to monitor him through the night. His condition is going to remain unstable for the next several hours." He paused. Then he added the last part carefully, the way doctors add things that need to be heard but won't be easy to hold on to. "If he had been brought in 6 hours later than he was, we would be having a very different conversation right now." He let that land. Then he gave them the floor number, the room number, and left. The 3 brothers sat in the waiting room for a long time after that. The television ran its mute news. The fluorescent light above them buzzed very slightly. And the sentence that nobody said out loud. The sentence that all 3 of them were sitting inside separately, that lived in the space between them like something that had always been there but had no name until now, was this: "We didn't know. And we didn't know because we never once thought to ask." Consequences don't appear suddenly. They arrive quietly, after days of being ignored. They arrive in fluorescent waiting rooms with their shoes off and their oxygen low. They arrive looking smaller than you expected. They arrive when you finally have time to notice, which is always too late, and never late enough to be too late to change. Cade sat with his hands clasped and didn't move. The overnight report came back at 4 in the morning. Condition: unstable. Temperature still elevated. Oxygen still assisted. But the antibiotics were working. The infection was being addressed. His body, young and otherwise healthy, was fighting back. Slowly. With effort. He was still unconscious. Varric, who had not slept, who had not spoken in 3 hours, stood up and walked to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the city that was just beginning to go gray with early morning. Soren came to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything, but there was a shift between them that night, slow and wordless, that would still be present a month later when everything else had changed. They went back to the apartment at 6 in the morning to change clothes. The hallway still had glass in it. Nobody had cleaned it up. In the urgency of the paramedics and the hospital and the overnight, nobody had thought about the hallway floor. So it was there, glass, dried liquid, the tray pushed to one side where someone had kicked it out of the way. The exact place where Elio had gone down. Cade stood in the hallway and looked at it for a long time. Then he went to the kitchen, got the broom and swept it himself. Not because a housekeeper wasn't available. Not because it needed to happen right now. But because standing there looking at it was the only other option, and he was done standing. Soren watched him from the doorway without commenting. They changed. They went back to the hospital. They sat. The 3 of them, across 3 separate hours of that morning, separately and without coordinating it, began running the same mental timeline. Going back. Trying to identify the first moment. When was the first sign? Cade got to the kettle. The trembling. The clang against the mug. He had looked up. He had seen something. A stillness in the way Elio stood that wasn't his normal stillness. He had looked back down. Why had he looked back down? Because there was a crisis. Because his attention had a hierarchy and the hierarchy did not include Elio. Because in the operational structure of his mind, Elio existed outside the category of things that required monitoring. Not because Cade had decided that consciously. Because no one had ever decided it at all. That was the thing. Nobody had ever decided anything about Elio one way or the other. He had simply arrived. And he had remained. And because he had never made a demand, never created a problem, never required anything from any of them, they had collectively, silently, without discussion or intention, placed him in the category of things that run themselves. Like the heating system, like the building's water pressure. Like a person who didn't need anyone to check on him because he had never indicated that he did. Soren, sitting in the hospital waiting room with a coffee he wasn't drinking, pulled up the internal syndicate staff log on his phone. Not because he was looking for anything specific. Because Soren, when confronted with a system failure, always went to the log. What he found was simple and devastating. Elio was not on the log. Not in the way that meant someone had removed him. In the way that meant he had never been added. When the syndicate formally housed someone, protected personnel, witnesses, family members of active contractors, Those individuals were entered into a welfare tracking system. Weekly check-ins. Medical access. A point of contact within the organization whose job included noting any changes in status. Elio had been classified as temporary upon arrival. Temporary placements used a different protocol. Shorter oversight windows, faster reassessment cycles. But the reassessment that was supposed to happen after 30 days, the one that would have either confirmed his temporary status or formalized his placement, had never happened. Because the person assigned to conduct it had been pulled to a different operation. And nobody had reassigned the task. And 3 months had passed. Soren set the phone face down on his knee and pressed his hand flat against it and looked at the ceiling. Staff had assumed the Alphas were directly monitoring Elio. The Alphas had assumed the welfare system was handling it. The welfare system had a gap that was 3 months wide and shaped exactly like one overlooked reassignment. This is how power hides responsibility. Not in malice, in assumptions, in the spaces between people who each believe someone else is covering the ground they're standing on. Varric came back from wherever he had gone. A walk, probably the kind of long deliberate walk he took when his mind needed something his body could do, and sat down next to Cade. Nobody checked on him, he said. Not a question. A statement that needed to be said out loud in order to be real. No, Cade said. In 3 months. No. Varric nodded once. Slowly. Then he was quiet for a long time. That's a system problem, he said finally. Not a him problem. Cade looked at his brother. Varric rarely offered analysis. He operated, he executed, he held lines. Analysis was Cade's territory and they both knew it. But he had said what he said with a certainty that sat differently in the room. Because he was right. Elio had not failed to communicate a need. Elio had existed in a structure that had no channel for his needs. There was no mechanism, no pathway, no person designated to ask. The problem had not been Elio's silence. The problem had been that silence was the only option they had ever given him. Soren opened his phone again and began a document. He titled it, Operational Gap Welfare Oversight. He started writing. And the deeper he wrote, the further he traced the gap back through the syndicate structure, the worse it got. Because Elio was not the only one. Across the Nocthra Syndicate's network, there were 14 individuals currently classified under some variation of protected status, temporary placement, or transitional housing. Some of them had been in that status for months, a few for longer, and when Soren filtered the welfare log for check-in records, the gaps were everywhere. Not all as severe as Elio's. Not all as dangerous. But present. Consistent. Distributed across the organization like cracks in a wall that nobody had bothered to look at directly. He kept writing. He was still writing when the doctor came out and said Elio's fever had dropped 2 points overnight and his oxygen saturation had improved. Soren stopped writing. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and held them there. The audit could wait 15 minutes. Elio woke up on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with a gasp or a sudden movement. He simply became conscious, the gradual, climbing kind of consciousness that comes after the body has been very far down and has had to work its way back up. Sensation before awareness. Awareness before understanding. He was not on the floor. That was the first thing he registered. He was not on the floor of his bedroom, and he was not cold, and the surface beneath him was softer than his mattress. He could hear machinery, the specific rhythm of medical equipment, the beep with its regular interval, the low hum of something that was helping him breathe more efficiently than he could on his own. Hospital. He lay still and took stock the way he always did. His chest was better. Not right. Not normal. But the weight that had been sitting behind his sternum for weeks was different now. Present, but no longer pressing with the same relentless downward force. He could take a careful breath, and it went further than it had in a long time before it caught. His hands were still. No trembling. Someone had put a blanket over him. He turned his head slightly and listened. The room had people in it. Not moving, not talking, but present. He could hear the quality of occupied space, the slight shift of weight in chairs, the particular quality of breath that meant 3 people, not 1, not 2. 3. He knew the breathing patterns. He had memorized them months ago without deciding to. He said quietly to no one in particular, "Did I cause trouble?" The room went very still. Then Cade said, "No." His voice came from the left, closer than expected. Elio turned his head toward the sound. "You didn't cause anything," Cade said. And there was something in his voice that Elio had not heard there before. Not softness exactly, Cade didn't do softness, not the performative kind. Something more like weight. The specific heaviness of a man carrying something he has decided to carry correctly from now on. Elio nodded once. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have said something earlier." Nobody in the room responded immediately, because the correct response, the honest one, was that yes, perhaps he should have, but also that the structure he existed in had never once made it feel safe or possible or worth trying. And acknowledging both of those things at the same time, out loud in a hospital room, was something none of the three brothers had fully worked out how to do yet. Soren broke the silence. "We're changing some things," he said. "In the organization." Elio said nothing. "You'll be briefed when you're stronger." Elio almost said that he didn't need to be briefed. He almost said that it wasn't his organization, that he wasn't part of it in any real sense, that he had always been temporary. The word lived right at the back of his throat, ready to come out the way old beliefs do when they've been sitting there long enough to feel like facts. He didn't say it, partly because it took energy he didn't currently have, and partly because something in the word briefed had landed differently than anything any of them had said to him in 3 months. Like he was someone whose awareness mattered. Like he was someone who would still be there to be briefed. He turned his face slightly toward the ceiling. The hospital sounds moved around him. A cart in the hallway, a call button somewhere distant, the steady rhythm of machines that had been keeping watch all night. He said, "The kettle. On Thursday morning. I dropped it against the mug." Nobody responded. "Cade looked up," Elio said. Flat. Not an accusation. Just a reconstruction delivered carefully. And then he looked back down. The room was very quiet. "I knew then," Elio said, "that I could have said something and it would have been processed, handled, checked off a list. But I didn't know how to make it matter enough to change anything." He stopped. "Let that sit." Then he said, "I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because you're changing systems. And the system isn't just who gets checked on. It's whether the person being checked on believes the check-in is real." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Soren said, finally, "That's in the document now." Elio didn't respond, but something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something quieter than both of those. The expression of someone who said a true thing and had it received as true for the first time. He closed his eyes. The machines kept their rhythm. 3 chairs stayed occupied. All night, without discussion, without being asked. 3 chairs, 3 brothers, in a room that one of them had never thought to enter in 3 months, and now could not seem to leave. Soren's document had become something else by the time Elio was moved to a recovery room. What started as an operational gap report had turned into a full policy proposal. 22 pages, formatted, cited with internal precedent, distributed to the syndicate's 7 senior lieutenants with a cover message that was 3 sentences long and did not invite discussion so much as announce a decision. The proposal had 3 core mandates. First, every individual under Nocthra Syndicate protection, regardless of classification, regardless of duration, regardless of formal assignment status, would be entered into the welfare tracking system within 24 hours of placement. No exceptions. No grace periods for temporary classifications. Every person, every time from the day they arrived. Second, wellness checks would be conducted on a defined schedule by a designated point of contact. Not assumed. Not delegated to general staff. Named. 1 person, 1 assignment. Documented confirmation required weekly. If the check-in was missed, it escalated automatically to senior level within 12 hours. Third, medical access. Full. Every individual under protection would have access to syndicate-contracted medical care, primary care, emergency care, prescription access, with no barrier requiring approval from the alphas or senior leadership. The access would be direct, immediate, and recorded. The resistance came within an hour of distribution. 3 of the 7 lieutenants responded. The objections were practical and financial and delivered in the flat, professional language of people who had spent years optimizing systems for efficiency. One of them used the phrase resource allocation challenge. Another raised the question of whether temporary placements warranted the same level of infrastructure as formal contracts. A third asked, politely, about the cost-benefit ratio of extending full medical access to individuals who were not operationally contributing. These were not unreasonable arguments in isolation. Cade understood that. The syndicate ran on precision and margin. Every resource had a purpose, every expenditure had a return, and the idea of extending full medical infrastructure to every individual who passed through their network under any classification did carry a real logistical cost. He understood the arithmetic. He also understood that arithmetic had been the reason a 19-year-old had spent 2 weeks deteriorating in a room 20 feet from the most powerful men in the building. The arithmetic had not protected anyone. It had just created a very clean record of why no one was responsible. Cade read each response once. He did not respond to any of them individually. He called a meeting the full senior leadership within the hour in the syndicate's secured conference room on the 4th floor. The room had 12 seats. All 12 were filled. He sat at the head of the table and let them say what they had already said in writing. He listened to all of it without expression. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. He let each person finish completely, including the ones who said the same thing 3 different ways because they thought repetition would land where directness hadn't. When the room finished, Cade sat for a moment. He said 4 words. If they live under our protection, they live. Nobody responded immediately. He let the silence run. That is not a philosophy discussion, he said. That is not a cost analysis. I am not interested in a cost analysis. If we cannot protect the people under our roof, if we cannot maintain the basic oversight required to know whether someone in our own building is alive and functional, then the word protection means nothing, and we are not the organization we believe ourselves to be. He paused. Anyone who cannot operate under that principle is welcome to tell me now, directly, so we can discuss their continued role. The room stayed very quiet. Nobody told him anything. The policy was approved. Unanimously in the technical sense, which means that every person in the room raised their hand or said yes or nodded when asked, even the ones who had spent the previous 40 minutes explaining why it was logistically complicated. Because that is what happens when the person at the head of the table makes the stakes clear and means it. The policy was approved. Implementation began within the week. Soren coordinated the rollout with the same precision he applied to every operational system: timelines, accountability chains, documentation requirements, confirmation protocols. He built it the way you build something you intend to last. Not a patch, a structure. There was resistance in the implementation too, quieter and more distributed, the low friction of people who agreed in principle and dragged in practice. Soren addressed it the way he addressed all friction, by making compliance easier than resistance. He built forms that took 3 minutes to complete. He set calendar invitations that auto-populated. He assigned a dedicated coordinator whose only job was to ensure the weekly checks happened and were recorded. He built a system that could not forget. Because the old system's failure had not been cruelty. It had been forgetting. Real power isn't control. It's accountability when control fails. And accountability requires infrastructure, actual, specific, named infrastructure. Not good intentions. Not assumptions about who is watching. Names, times, records. A coordinator whose job it is to notice. The Nocthra Syndicate had been built on the idea that it never let anything slip through. It had let a person slip through. And the person it had let slip through was currently in a hospital bed on the 7th floor learning how to take a full breath again. Soren filed the final version of the policy on a Friday afternoon. He closed his laptop. He sat for a moment, not thinking about the next task, not cross-referencing anything, just sitting. He thought about Elio the way you think about something you are responsible for understanding now that you have failed to understand it before. Carefully, honestly, without the comfort of assuming the failure was anyone else's. Elio had been in the apartment for 3 months. In 3 months, Soren had spoken to him directly. Not in passing, not about logistics, but directly, fewer times than he could count on one hand. He had not asked his last name for the first 2 weeks. He had not asked about his history, his preferences, his limitations, his strengths. He had not asked anything. He had observed his presence the way you observe furniture that functions correctly, with the particular passive non-attention that means you are satisfied the thing exists and is doing what things like it are supposed to do. And Elio had done exactly what people do when they are treated like furniture. He had become very, very quiet. He had removed every possible sign of need. He had made himself frictionless. And then he had gotten sick and stayed sick and gone further down and never said anything, because in 3 months, not one person in that apartment had created a single moment where saying something felt like it would change anything. Soren sat with that until it sat in him the way the truth sits when you stop arguing with it. Then he stood up. He took the elevator to the 7th floor. He walked to room 714. He stopped at the door. He knocked before he entered. It was a small thing, the smallest thing, the kind of thing that costs nothing and takes 1 second and most people would not even register as a deliberate act. But Elio, who heard everything, who registered the absence of things as clearly as he registered their presence, who had spent 3 months in an apartment where nobody knocked and nobody paused and nobody arrived at his door as anything other than an afterthought, Elio heard the knock. And before Soren had even pushed the door open, something in the set of Elio's shoulders, something in the way he turned toward the sound, changed. It was the first time anyone had knocked. And it was the first time Elio had understood, in his body rather than just his mind, that something about the way this worked was going to be different from now on. The first week home was quiet in a way that was different from the old quiet. The old quiet had been the quiet of oversight, of people in the same space with separate concerns, occupying shared air without connection, each system running independently with no acknowledgement of the others. That quiet had the quality of a room where nobody has opened a window in a long time. Technically breathable, technically fine. This quiet was different. This one had awareness in it. Elio came home on a Thursday. He walked in with a follow-up medication schedule, a list of restrictions that he had already memorized, and a discharge nurse who said he should not be lifting anything heavier than a cup for 2 weeks. He said he understood. He walked to his room with one hand brushing the wall. Not because he was lost, but because his body was still recalibrating, still rebuilding the physical confidence that 2 weeks of illness had stripped away. He closed his door. He sat on his bed. He could hear the apartment outside, quieter than the crisis period, nothing like the celebration that had been interrupted. Just the regular sounds, the building settling, a phone in another room, footsteps that moved differently than they had before, slower, more deliberate, like people who had recently learned to pay attention to what their movement displaced. He noticed everything. That was not new. What was new was that the noticing came back with something attached to it that he wasn't sure how to name yet. Not hope exactly. Something more careful than hope. Something that understood hope had weight and didn't want to put the weight down in the wrong place. The changes were small and they were not announced. 2 days after he came home, he woke to find that breakfast had been left within reach of his room. Not in the kitchen, not on the table where he would have to navigate the full space to find it, but on the narrow shelf just inside his door where he always left his shoes. A plate, a cup, still warm. No note, no explanation. He stood in the doorway of his room for a moment. Then he took the plate and ate sitting on his bed and said nothing. The medical schedule arrived via Soren the same day. A document read to him in detail, times and medication names and follow-up appointment dates. Read out slowly and clearly and without impatience. Every item confirmed before Soren moved to the next. When it was done, Soren asked if he had questions. Elio said he didn't. Soren said, "If anything changes, anything physical, any symptom, anything that feels wrong, you tell one of us directly. Not in the morning. When it happens." He said it without making it a big moment. Without apology. Just as a new operating principle stated plainly. Elio said, "Okay." He meant it. He thought he might actually mean it. Varric started doing a thing that had no name and was never discussed. Once in the evening, without fail, he would appear at the edge of whatever space Elio was in, the kitchen, the hallway, once at the doorway of his room, and say, in the same flat tone he said everything, "You good?" 2 words. Every day. It had started on the second night home. Elio had heard the footsteps stop outside his door, the specific pause that meant someone was on the other side but not yet committed to knocking. He had waited. Then Varric's voice, through the door, "You good?" He had almost said, "Who is asking?" Because the Varric he had observed for 3 months was a man who moved through spaces with purpose and left them the same way, who did not linger, who operated on the logic of tasks and outcomes and had no apparent use for small talk or welfare checks or the 2-word ritual of seeing whether another person was okay. He did not ask. He just said yes. And the next night, at almost the same time, the footsteps came again. And the same 2 words. By the 4th night, it had the quality of a thing that had always been, the way a recurring sound becomes part of a space's identity. Varric at the edge of wherever Elio was, 2 words, the question and the answer, and then the footsteps moving away. Elio always said yes. On the 4th day he said, "My chest is a little tight today." Varric stood there for a second. Just stood. Elio could hear him processing. Not struggling with it, just taking a moment to reroute from the expected answer to the actual one. Then he said, "I'll call the doctor." He did. The doctor adjusted one of the medications. By the following morning the tightness had eased. It was a small exchange, functionally minor, the kind of thing that would appear in no record and no report and be forgotten entirely by anyone who wasn't Elio. But Elio sat with it for a long time after, turning it over, trying to understand why it felt like it weighed as much as it did. He thought he had figured it out by the evening. It felt like that much because it was the first time in 3 months that something he said had changed something. Not been ignored. Not been filed away. Not been met with the particular silence that meant it had registered as less important than whatever else was happening. He had said a thing, a small, true thing, and it had mattered to someone enough to act on. He sat with that for a long time. The physical recovery moved slowly. Some days he felt close to himself. Other days his lungs reminded him, sharply and without subtlety, that they were still repairing and that he should not confuse improving for recovered. He rested when his body told him to rest. He moved when it allowed. He did not try to make the coffee for the first week. Nobody commented on that. Nobody had expected him to. There was a morning, the 8th day home, when Cade passed him in the hallway and stopped. Not to say anything in particular. He just stopped walking and stood there for a moment, like a man who had planned to keep going and found he couldn't. "How did you sleep?" he asked. Elio said, "Better than before." Cade nodded. He stayed in the hallway for another moment. Then he said, quietly, not softly, Cade didn't do soft, but quietly, "Why didn't you tell us?" Not accusatory. The way a person asks when they genuinely cannot reconstruct the logic and have been trying to understand it for 8 days and have run out of angles. Elio was quiet for a moment. He thought about giving the safe answer, the practical answer, the one that pointed to timing and the crisis and not wanting to be a problem during a difficult operational period. He gave the honest answer instead. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. Cade looked at him, not through him, not past him, at him. With the same direct, complete attention he gave to things that required solving. "It mattered," he said. 2 words, final as a gavel. He kept walking. Elio stood in the hallway alone and let the words sit where they had landed. They were not an apology. They were not a declaration. They were just a fact, stated by a man who dealt exclusively in facts. But they were the truest thing anyone in that apartment had said to him in 3 months. And he carried them with him for the rest of the day like they were something he didn't want to put down. Guilt rarely speaks loudly. It shows up as careful behavior. In breakfast left at a doorway. In 2-word check-ins from a man who used words like currency and spent them accordingly. In a document that Soren built so that no one else in the network would ever fall through the same gap. In Cade stopping in a hallway when he could have kept walking. It shows up every day in small things, until the small things are so consistent that they start to feel like something else. Something that doesn't have a word yet, but is getting closer. 5 weeks later, it snowed. Not a major storm. The kind of snow that the city absorbed without drama. A few inches overnight that sat on the tops of buildings and turned the streets quiet for exactly one morning before the traffic and the salt took over. But the apartment windows were white with it when Elio woke up. He couldn't see the white. He could feel the particular quality of the light, the way sound carried differently when snow was on the ground, softer, absorbed. The city's usual hard-edged acoustics turned briefly gentle. He lay in bed and listened to it for a few minutes. Then he got up. The apartment was calm, not silent. It was never fully silent. There was always something running, something humming, the particular low-grade operational noise of a space that ran things. But the particular quality of calm that had settled over the place in the last several weeks was different from anything that had existed here before. Like a clock that had been running too fast for years and had finally been adjusted. He moved through the kitchen without keeping his hand on the wall. He didn't need it anymore. His legs were steady. His chest was clear, fully clear now, for the first time in months, each breath going all the way down without resistance. He filled the kettle by feel, the way he always had, and set it on the back left burner. He stood at the counter and waited for it to heat. He heard a door open. Cade's. The light came on. He felt the ambient change in the apartment's energy, that particular shift, and then the footsteps. Not toward the bathroom. Not toward the office. Toward the kitchen. Cade came in and stopped at the edge of the kitchen space. He did that now, stopped at the edge before entering. A small acknowledgement that the kitchen was Elio's space in some fundamental way that they had both accepted without naming. Tea? Elio asked. Coffee, Cade said. Kettle's on. Cade came in and stood at the other end of the counter. He did not reach for his phone. He did not open his laptop. He stood with his hands on the counter and looked at the window above the sink, which was showing the white morning light of a snow-covered city. They were quiet together for a moment. Not the old quiet. This one had room in it. The kettle began to build toward its sound and Elio turned to get the mugs, 3 by habit, and Cade said, "You don't have to make theirs." Elio paused. "I know," he said. "I want to." Cade was quiet. "It's not the same as before," Elio said carefully. "Before I did it because it was the only thing I could think of to do. Now I do it because—" He stopped, thought about the word. "Because I want to." The distinction was small, but it was everything. Because before, he had made that coffee in the dark of a role nobody had assigned and nobody had acknowledged, moving through the space like furniture that occasionally produced useful things. He had made it to survive, to justify his presence, to fill the silence in his hands before the silence got into his thoughts. Now he made it because he was still here, and being still here, choosing something, even something small, was different from just enduring. Cade let that sit. Then he said, "We built an empire that couldn't see the person in front of us." He said it the way he said things he had already thought about at length. Not discovering the idea out loud, but stating a conclusion he had already reached. Flat, final, owned completely. Elio poured the water. He said, "I know, not to release Cade from anything. Not to offer comfort that softened the truth. Just acknowledgement. The honest answer to an honest thing." Cade turned from the window and looked at Elio. Actually looked the way he had been doing since the hospital, the way that was still slightly new and still occasionally startling to Elio, who was not used to being looked at by this man as though the looking was intentional. "The policy Soren put in place," Cade said. "It's being implemented across the full network. Not just here. 14 individuals, plus whatever new placements come in going forward." Elio said nothing. "You're the reason for that," Cade said. "Not as a gift, as a fact." Elio was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You endured something you shouldn't have had to endure," Cade said. "And that exposed something we couldn't keep not seeing." He paused. "That counts." The kettle finished. Elio poured carefully. 3 mugs, even though 2 of them were not for him. He set Cade's at the right edge of the counter, where Cade's hand would find it without looking, because Elio had been watching where Cade's hand went every morning for 3 months and he knew. Cade picked it up. He didn't move away from the counter. Usually he took the mug and went to the office. Every morning, without variation. The kitchen was for acquisition, you got what you needed and you went back to work. This morning he stayed. He stood at the counter and drank his coffee and looked at the snow-white window and didn't go anywhere. Elio stood at his end of the counter and drank his tea. He had switched to tea during the recovery and had not switched back, and also didn't go anywhere. They stood like that for a while. The snow outside was starting to take on the gray of a city morning now, the white softening at the edges as the traffic and the salt and the collective weight of the day began to work on it. But for now, from the kitchen window, it still looked clean. Soren appeared in the doorway. Rumpled, early, clearly hadn't slept as late as he usually did on quieter mornings. He looked at both of them. He didn't say anything. He came in, got his mug, leaned against the far counter. 3 people in a kitchen. Actually in a kitchen. Not moving through it, not acquiring from it, not performing separate functions in shared physical space. Just in it, together. With the snow on the window and the mugs in their hands and the morning doing what mornings do when nobody is in a hurry to end it. Nobody was in a hurry. That was new too. The Ashford brothers had operated their entire adult lives in the register of urgency. The next call, the next decision, the next problem that needed solving before it became a crisis. Urgency had a texture they had all lived inside for so long they had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator. It was just the background sound of being them. This morning the urgency was quiet. And nobody rushed to fill the quiet with something productive. Varric, still sitting on the counter, drank his coffee and looked at the snow and looked at Elio and looked back at the snow. He didn't say anything. But the looking meant something. The specific deliberateness of a man who had decided to pay attention and was carrying out that decision in real time. Soren's phone was on the counter face down. Not silenced. Face down, which for Soren was the equivalent of hanging a closed sign on a door. He was here, in this kitchen, and the rest could wait 10 minutes. The 4 of them held the morning together without naming it. Eventually Cade set his mug down and turned slightly toward Elio. Not facing him fully. Not yet, maybe not ever quite fully, Cade was who he was, but turned enough to be directional. To mean something. He held out his hand. Not to shake. Not as a formality. Palm up, slightly extended, the gesture of someone offering something without demanding it be taken. Not a command. Not an obligation. Not the efficient, transactional kind of contact that the Ashford brothers had in their operational vocabulary. Just a hand. Offered. Elio felt it. The shift in the air, the small change in Cade's body position that his perception registered automatically. He was quiet for a moment. He thought, and he wasn't sure why this particular thought arrived, but it did, about the hallway. About that first Tuesday in the kitchen. About the word contained in a report he had never read but had understood anyway. About 30 nights of lying in the dark deciding tomorrow, deciding it was safer to be invisible than to take up space that hadn't been offered. About the floor of the hallway. About waking up in a hospital room to find that 3 chairs were occupied. About breakfast left at a doorway without explanation. About 2 words every evening, you good. About a policy with his name underneath it, even though his name wasn't in it anywhere. About being briefed. About someone knocking before they entered. About Cade stopping in a hallway when he could have kept going. Elio looked toward the hand. He could not see it, but he knew exactly where it was. He reached forward. His fingers found Cade's palm, and Cade's hand closed around his. Not tight, not commanding, just present. A contact that said, you are here and we know it. You are here and we are not going to forget it again. Elio stood very still for a moment. Outside, the snow was still on the ground. The city was still the city, the noise and the weight of it, the underground currents of power and territory and consequence. The Nocthra Syndicate was still what it was. These 3 men were still who they were. None of that had been erased or softened or resolved into something easier. But inside the kitchen, in the particular quiet of a snow morning, with 4 mugs and 4 people and a policy that now protected 14 others in the network, and a new system that meant no one's absence would go unnoticed again. Something had shifted. Something real. Elio thought, this is what being seen feels like. Not a gift. Not a reward. Not something you receive when you finally break and collapse on a hallway floor in front of the right people at the right time. Being seen is not something that happens to you like luck. It is a responsibility. On both sides. And for the first time since he had arrived in this apartment. Since the word contained. Since the word temporary. Since the first morning he had made 3 mugs of coffee in the dark and retreated before anyone woke up. Elio Damien Osei understood, completely and without question, that he was not temporary anymore. He was not going anywhere, and neither were they. Being seen isn't a gift. It's a responsibility. And the moment you accept that responsibility, the moment you stop letting people disappear into your assumptions, everything changes. Not loudly, not all at once, but completely. If the story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit hardest. Was it the hallway? The hospital? The hand? Or was it something smaller? Something you recognized from your own life before you even realized it? Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones about people falling. They're the ones about people finally being caught. Chapter 11 would be a different story. But this is the one that needed to be told.